Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Reserve Studies 101, the Reserve Component List. There's so much I could say on this topic. It's a foundation of the reserve study itself, but the principles of assembling an effective reserve component list is almost beautiful in its simplicity. So that's what I'll focus on today. As Paige indicated, this course is now approved for CE credit through CAM-ICB, and those of you who indicated in the registration process that you were CMCA certified will receive a certificate of completion within approximately a week. Well, before I jump into today's material, let me remind you that this is a live presentation and everyone's been muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. But I like an interactive presentation, so every once in a while I'll ask for your feedback, and the way to respond is to raise your hand electronically by clicking the hands raised icon in your control panel that looks like the little one that you see on the screen. And if you came with a question, or if at any time you have a question that arises due to something I've said, just type it in the dialog box in your control panel, again similar to the one that you see on the screen. Paige will be monitoring that throughout our session today and select from those at the end during our Q&A session. I hope that you're prepared to take some notes, but like all our webinars, we're recording this session, so it will be available on YouTube and reservestudy.com for future playback. Another resource is an outline that we'll send to everyone who fills out a brief survey at the end of today's session. That outline will contain attachments and links to our featured resources. So without further delay, grab your mouse and click on the hands raised icon in your webinar control panel if you're ready for me to get going on the presentation. Hands raised. Oh, nice. I've got a list here and I'm seeing them all the way up and down the list. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Here we go. Your job as a board member is to provide for the needs of the association. Your job as a manager is to help the board run the association smoothly. But when an association is regularly battered by unsettling surprise expenses, the needs of the association aren't being met and operation is anything but smooth. And in addition, there's no peace in an association when the roof is old, there's no money to replace it, and there's no plan to replace it. Everyone's just wringing their hands. An accurate reserve study with an accurate reserve component list gives you years or decades to prepare gradually and responsibly for the needs of the association. The result is peace, fairness, and lack of unsettling surprises. Companies like ours are here to help you do your job well as a board member or manager, providing for the needs of the association. We want you and your association to have an advantage over the other associations who don't plan ahead and who are unprepared for the inevitable deterioration of their common areas. The advantages of planning ahead are minimized risk of special assessments and surprises, minimized exposure to expensive deferred maintenance, and maximized home values. These good things start when you have the right projects on your reserve component list. To illustrate, this graph shows reserve expenses at a typical association. All the expenses appear very irregular, but all my comments today will be based on National Reserve Study standards and the fact that even though these reserve expenses appear irregular, they are inevitable and predictable. You can see reserve expenses coming from as far away as 20 or 30 years. That much advance warning allows you plenty of time to prepare. There's going to be plenty of surprises in life, but reserve expenses shouldn't be one of them. Keeping things simple, every reserve study has three parts: the reserve component list, a calculation of reserve fund strength, and a calculated reserve funding plan. The component list identifies the scope and schedule of reserve expenses facing your association. Reserve fund strength reveals how well your reserve fund balance has kept pace with deterioration of your components. And the reserve funding plan reveals reserve contributions that are needed to offset the ongoing deterioration, again, of those components. We're just going to cover the component list today, which forms the foundation on which the other two parts are built. We have those other two webinars Reserve Studies 102 and 103. We regularly update them and present them live like we're doing today for 101. And you can listen to recorded versions of those by finding them on reservestudy.com or on YouTube. The material I'll be covering today is based on National Reserve Study standards. These standards guide us Reserve Study professionals, but it's the board members and managers nationwide who are the ones who truly benefit from these consistent principles. And that's because we have nice standards like the main focus of today's session. National Reserve Study standards have a stable and repeatable four-part test that help us determine which projects are to be included as components in your reserve study. And here's the test. If you're taking notes, this is a key concept to jot down. To be included in a reserve component list, a project needs to pass all four parts of this test. It needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, not private property or owned or maintained by another entity. It needs to have a limited useful life, not be something that's expected to effectively last forever. It needs to have a predictable remaining useful life. That means if you can't anticipate it getting to a particular point in time when it will need to be replaced, if you can't put a number on it, then by definition it is a surprise and you can't plan for it in the reserve budget. And finally, the project needs to be above a minimum threshold of significance, above what can be easily absorbed into the ongoing operational budget. That threshold is often in the range of 0.5% to 1% of an association's annual budget. If it doesn't pass all four elements of this four-part test, it shouldn't be in your reserve study. And with this test, your reserve funds will repair or replace only common area elements with a useful life, predictable remaining useful life, and with a significant, to your association, repair or replacement cost. There is no industry master list or list proprietary to a particular reserve study professional. This four-part test limits confusion and limits variety of projects appearing in a reserve study to just those that should appear. And the great thing is that this simple four-part test applies to all associations. Nice new townhomes, high-rises, older associations, and even exotic or resort properties. Deterioration is inevitable and reserve expenses are very predictable. The reserve component list allows associations to prepare so everyone can pay their fair share along the way, and so your association accumulates gradually the funds in time to avoid a dreaded special assessment and do the necessary projects. So join me for a few minutes as I take you on an imaginary walk through a few associations to show you how this works. You might want to mentally start practicing asking yourself if the component, think about the four-part test, is common area maintenance with a limited life, predictable remaining useful life, and above a threshold of significance. So here we go. At this association, the governing documents say that air conditioning condensers are private property. They belong to the individual owner. So even though they're on common area, in the landscaped area, they failed test number 1 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. And this association has concrete underground parking. The structural elements expected to last practically forever, so because it doesn't have a limited useful life, it fails test number 2 and shouldn't appear in your reserve component list. In that same garage floor is a sump pump. This is a critical common area component that pumps water up from a catch pit at the low point in the garage to the street level drains. Nobody that I met during my inspection ever heard it run, but the garage never flooded, so it must be working. The maintenance man said it's never been replaced in the 10 years since he's been at the property, and a pump like this typically has a useful life of about 10 to 15 years, so it's reasonable to expect that the remaining useful life is getting close to zero, ready to fail, probably just in time for the next storm. So when you're looking at or preparing the reserve component list, be prepared to make some estimates. Reserve planning is not a field of certainties. Let's go up to the roof of that building. On this flat roof is a small top-story hallway ventilator fan. While you can see obviously some rust on the housing, it's definitely old, inside is a simple motor, fan, and belt. The association fixes this ventilator, its components, as needed as a minor operational expense, so it fails test number 4 and also shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. So, everyone with me? You see how the 4-part test works? Give me a show of hands at this point in time if you're tracking so far. Nice. Okay, very good. I'm going to put hands down. Okay, let's start on some more difficult components. Take it up a notch. This is a photo of an underground garage. This association put sheet metal gutters under areas of piping in the ceiling because of leaks, trying to keep them off people and cars. Interesting that they spent time and energy putting together a gutter system rather than fixing the leaks, but that's a different subject. So follow with me as I go through the 4-part test. Is plumbing a common area maintenance responsibility? Yes. Does it have a useful life? Yes, as it's clearly deteriorated and failing. Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? Yes. In fact, I probably believe it hit 0 a few years ago when they put up the gutter. And would you expect a repiping project like this to be above a minimum cost? Absolutely. I'd expect a repiping project like this actually to be very expensive. So repiping the garage area is clearly appropriate for reserve designation. Come on, let's advance. There we go. And here's a picture of a hillside that just experienced a slope failure. It may not look like a big deal, just throw some dirt back up on the hill, but they just got a $50,000 estimate to stabilize and replant this hill. So the question is it predictable? Nobody knew this particular hillside was ready to fail, but this large association has extensive hills throughout its common areas. It's a nice suburb hillside area, and at the 20-year-old point, this is the 4th time a hill somewhere has slipped. So the simple math is that the hillside slips on average about once every 5 years. They may not know exactly where, but association history suggests that if it's happened before, it'll likely happen a few more times perhaps, and you might say every 5 years or so. So the lesson here is let your own history help you prepare wisely for your own future. So you now know which projects appear on the reserve component list, which don't, why, and how we determine it. The components need to pass a 4-part test. And note that there's no number for a maximum year limit. Obviously projections get fuzzier the further you go out to the future, but if a major project is significant and predictable, like a roof, siding replacement, elevator modernization, or replacing a dock structure, it's wise to have projects with a useful life and remaining useful life over 30 years on your reserve component list so you can take advantage of all those years to prepare financially. It's typically big projects that have such a long useful life. So, what information do you collect or should you see for each component? Well, first, make sure that the component itself is accurately described. Reserve expenses are projects, not things. So don't expect to see a component called fence. Look for it to be described as fence replace or fence repaint. This is because it's possible and actually common to have more than one project for an asset. So look for an accurate description. And then for each component, expect to see the following information. Something identifiable. Typically this means a quantity, but it could also mean the serial number, a size like the BTU rating of a water or pool heater, maybe the horsepower of a pump, and then of course we expect to see the useful life in years, remaining useful life also in years, and the current replacement cost. We'll inflate these costs in the financial analysis portion of the reserve study, but here in the component list it should show current costs. Let's look at this simplified reserve component list. I've taken quantity out just to save some space, but you can see a clear description of each project. If you look halfway down, you can see seal and resurface, both for asphalt, and values for useful life, abbreviated UL, remaining useful life, abbreviated RUL, and the project's current replacement cost. Per national standards, a remaining useful life of 0 indicates a component needing replacement in the initial year of the reserve study, basically immediately. All the projects here are very reasonable and predictable. That's what you want to see. Note that the reserve component list for a small association will likely have a slightly different makeup than one for a large association, and that's because some components that are significant to a small association may fall under the level of reserve significance to a large association. I believe I said earlier that the reserve component list shows us the scope and schedule of an association's reserve expenses. Let me quickly explain that scope is the type of projects on your reserve component list and how big they are, while schedule is when these projects are expected to occur and recur over the years. And if you plot those out, the result is a map of expenses different for each association, and it'll change slightly from year to year. And this is the map of expenses for the component list from the prior slide. Now remember, irregular does not mean unpredictable. In reality, as the years goes by, these expenses may move around a little bit, get slightly larger or smaller, but none of these expenses will go away. If your association ignores them, they'll just be the causes of special assessments or deferred maintenance or homes declining in value. And not all reserve components are equally significant. Typically, just a few components dominate your reserve study. Out of the 30 to 50 components in a typical reserve study, how many do you think are dominant? You got a guess? The answer is typically 5 or less. It's usually a wonderfully small number, and often the number of dominant components is even only 2 or 3. A reserve component list is kind of like a budget. You have large budget items worth extra attention, but most are smaller items. We don't want you to get overwhelmed with your reserve component list. If you're planning to check your reserve component list, look for the influential components. So which ones are the influential ones? Well, the dominant ones that deserve more of your time and attention vary on association type and region of the country. Now, for a typical townhome condo, the dominant components are roofing, painting, and asphalt. Usually pretty simple. If you go to cooler or moist climates, you can add siding and window or deck replacements. And in mid or high-rise condos, you typically don't have as much asphalt or roofing, but you do have major interior hallway projects and major mechanical projects such like HVAC systems, boilers, elevators, fire alarm systems, things like that. And in HOAs or planned developments, it's usually the roadway system and recreational components that are your most dominant. And here's an important tip. The most significant components are often not the ones with the largest replacement cost. Significance is measured in cost per year. Let me show you how that works. Let's suppose a big $100,000 roof project that happens every 25 years. Do the math, 100,000 divided by 25, that's $4,000 a year of deterioration. Let's compare that to a $50,000 repaint project that happens every 5 years. That's deteriorating at the rate of $10,000 a year. That's a lot more significant than the $4,000 a year of the roofing project on the left. So significance is rated by cost per year, and you might find that some projects that happen more frequently are more significant than more expensive projects that happen rarely. So that's a pretty good foundation of theory, the 4-part test, the information on each component that we gather, and identifying significant components. So grab your mouse. We're ready to turn a corner here and give me a hands raised click to show me you're ready for me to change course and share a little bit about how to work with a reserve study in real life. Okay, page, everyone seems to be tracking nicely. Okay, I'm going to put hands down. All right, let's talk about a little bit of reality. What do you do if a big project comes up and doesn't appear on your reserve study? It's missing. It may look like you've got plenty of cash in reserves, but you wonder, can you spend reserves on the project? Let's say the vendor reminds you that the association did that project about 10 years ago. It certainly sounds, as he describes it, like it's a predictable, recurring, significant expense that meets the four-part test. So, presuming that to be true, because it meets the definition of a reserve expense, spend the money from reserves and make sure to get that project added to your reserve component list in your next update. The underlying authority is National Reserve Study Standards and the four-part test. Hopefully your projects are captured in your reserve component list, but the true authority is National Reserve Study Standards. Okay, suppose you have multiple components made up of the same project, let's say roofing. What you want to do is, when you have different ages of an asset due to phased construction or reconstruction, let's say there was a major wildfire on the perimeter over on the B end of the association, and the association's got significantly fire damage and had to get all their roofs redone, something like that. Remember that the four-part test requires a component needs a distinct remaining useful life. So if you only have if you've only done part of a larger project, spend the money from reserves and then separate out the project in your reserve component list so each phase or each age of the project is clearly identified. And suppose you have a whole lot of something. Perimeter fencing and sidewalks are common examples. This one catches a lot of associations by surprise. Due to local factors like sprinklers, trees, or vegetation, you'll likely find the need for local partial replacement. And while you may not know exactly the location, kind of like that hillside that I mentioned a few minutes ago, you know that every few years you're going to need to spend some money to keep the asset in good shape by gradually replacing a portion. So you can create a partial replacement line item. Use your own association history of expenses to prevent future surprises. Now remember, if it's already happening at your association and you're currently paying for it from your operating budget, planning for the expense from reserves and preparing for it doesn't increase your association costs. You're just moving it from an unsettling miscellaneous expense to a controlled and predictable reserve expense. And let's talk about maintenance. Most components need normal maintenance. Normal daily, weekly, monthly maintenance, like carpets being vacuumed and shampooed, gutters and drains being cleaned, things like that, they should be funded through your operating budget. But some major components, like the cooling tower shown in the picture, need expensive scheduled maintenance. You may need a $20,000 refurb project at the 10-year point to help your $150,000 cooling tower get all the way to its 20-year design life. So think four-part test. Is it common area project? Does it have a predictable useful life? Following along, predictable remaining useful life and a significant cost? If it does, then a major refurbish, a scheduled major refurbish, should be a component in addition to total replacement of the project or the asset. And can you or should you ever spend reserves on a minor repair? Well, the answer is yes, when that expenditure extends and changes the component's useful life or remaining useful life. If something is broken locally, obviously fix it. But if a local repair means that it will make the component last a few years longer than previously planned, that is a legitimate use of reserve funds. The old fence in this picture is nearing the end of its useful life, clearly. But if installing couple new posts in this one location means you can delay replacing the entire fence for another year or two, spend the dollars from reserves, and extend the remaining useful life of your component in the next update. And then there's some it depends type projects. There are some components that can be a reserve expense at one association and an operating expense at another. Pool furniture, as we see here, is a common example. If you replace your entire set every 5 years, it can qualify as a reserve expense. But if you replace a piece at a time, here or there, it's more like an operating expense. And again, either way, the expense is the same to the association. It just comes from the right pocket or the left. So the lesson here is have your reserve component list fit the style of your association. And how much detail is appropriate? Do you list everything separately? You look at this rec room picture. It's almost like a game. You can see furniture, flooring, a pool table, walls that need to be painted, light fixtures, window treatments. Around the corner to the right is a small kitchen with a refrigerator and stove. Our recommendation is to not be too detailed because this room is one entity. Besides, it's far better for your association to think along the lines of that total refurbishment because it can give you a consistent look and feel, and it can allow you to consistently do projects together, effectively projects together, like painting and carpeting at the same time or replacing all the furniture at the same time so you get a nice consistent look. And in addition, this gives you some flexibility to potentially change the number of chairs and tables to better fit your usage needs or floor space. If you call it a refurbished project rather than X chairs, X tables, X bar stools, all those different line items. Okay, talk about insurance deductibles. Some areas of the country have some pretty significant and regular exposure to insurable losses. Earthquakes, hailstorms, flooding, hurricanes, things like that. So going back to the 4-part test, the answer is no. Reserving for insurance deductibles is inappropriate. Why? Because it fails both the useful life test and the remaining useful life test. You can't predict when these expenses will occur. They're extremely unfortunate. They're saddening projects, but these types of expenses are true surprises. And what about projects that don't meet the IRS definition for capital projects? A few samples are things like painting, tree trimming, and asphalt seal coating. Does that mean that these projects shouldn't be in your reserve study and that you can't spend reserves for these projects? No. Prepare your taxes according to IRS regulations and prepare your reserve study per National Reserve Study standards. If painting your building is a common area maintenance responsibility, if it has a well-defined useful life, remaining useful life, and if it's above a minimum cost of significance, it is a reserve component. The IRS regulates taxes, not reserves. If your association files tax form 1020, then you can reserve for these projects, and all your CPA needs to do is make a minor accommodation in your filing. Another example of overriding influence is state laws, where in some states they require a particular minimum list of components appear in your reserve study. Remember, these are minimum lists, not a complete or exhaustive list. And the bottom line there is that include all the components that meet the 4-part test. And finally, just a few weeks after you've published a reserve study, it's out of date because things have changed. So how often do you take the time and energy to update it? National Reserve Study standards define 3 types of reserve studies. A full reserve study typically only needs to be done once, but there are 2 types of update products to pick from. You see them there, the update with site visit and the update no site visit. Most associations do find that professionally prepared update products are surprisingly inexpensive. But do you really do it annually? What's the value there? Why would you do it? Well, Reserve contributions are typically one of your largest budget line items, so it's worth updating annually along with the rest of your budget. What we find is that associations that update the reserve study annually instead of every 5 years enjoy 35% fewer special assessments, and that's due to being able to budget more accurately. They can see those expenses coming, they anticipate, and they provide for the needs of the association. Associations in the habit of updating their reserve study every 3 years can reduce their special assessment risk by 29% by updating annually. Bottom line is that reserve expenses are significant, and there's real benefits to being able to plan based on updated information, not old information. And it almost seems like a simple question, but when does a component fail, and how does it fail? Well, the more you think about it, failure is different if it's a roof, or if it's a carpet in your unused stairwell, or if it's your entry sign. There's actually 5 different ways a component can fail, and the way it fails affects your decision whether to replace it on time or wait. The link on this slide and in today's outline is going to take you to an article that will help you understand those differences and make the wisest decisions. Another common question has to do with upgrading components when you replace them. When does a minor improvement become a major change, properly called a capital improvement, that is indeed something new and different enough that it's inappropriate for funding with replacement reserves? These 2 links on this slide that'll also appear in the outline are going to take you to articles based on National Reserve Study standards that help you understand the important differences and spend the appropriate amount, or I should say spend the money from the appropriate source. And I've spoken about National Reserve Study standards enough that we've also provided a link here and in your outline to see what those standards are and be able to maybe even file them away so you can have them as a reference. And that's our core material for Reserve Studies 101. At its simplest, it's all about applying the 4-part test. The component list helps you prepare for the inevitable deterioration at your association, and it gives you time to prepare and fulfill your role as a board member or manager. Here at Association Reserves, all we do for you is based on reliable National Reserve Study standard principles, guiding associations like yours to an improved future. It's what we do all the time. For further resources, in addition to the links that we'll be providing, we have a great library of materials on our website and our Learning Center, and the place to request a proposal so we can improve the future of your association, and the way to sign up on the right for our email list if you're not already on it. And as a thank you for all those who've attended today, our featured resource is our Reserve Component List ebook, and a copy of that will be provided to all attendees who fill out the survey at the end of today's session, and that'll come with the webinar outline. I hope you picked up some useful information about Reserve Component List today that'll help you be more effective leading your associations to an improved future, minimizing surprises, making wise spending decisions. So at this point in time, with the time available, I'll turn the microphone over to Paige, who will coordinate our Q&A time. Paige.